A new report on the BBC's coverage of economics has found that its journalism just isn't good enough. The report, which was commissioned by the BBC, claims that the corporation's journalists sometimes mislead their audience when it comes to the nation's finances. That's because they don't know enough, reach for lazy analogies, and oversimplify. The authors say this: "We think too many journalists lack understanding of basic economics or lack confidence reporting it. This brings a high risk to impartiality. In the period of this review, it particularly affected debt. Some journalists seem to feel instinctively that debt is simply bad, full stop, and don't appear to realise this can be contested and contestable. Several general assumptions seem to lurk like this, either unnoticed or uncorrected. Others that outsiders observed in the BBC coverage were, quote, more public spending is good and tax cuts are good. Whilst these views might seem to make intuitive sense, all favour some interests above others. Too often, it's not clear from a report that fiscal policy decisions are also political choices. They're not inevitable, it's just that governments like to present them that way. The language of necessity takes subtle forms. If the BBC adopts it, it can sound perilously close to policy endorsement." Now, pointing out that economic choices are always political is something we do on this show all the time, something actually you might remember Jeremy Corbyn talking about when it came to austerity being a political choice. So why can't the BBC manage it? The report offers an explanation in this passage. "The Westminster frame on things is the elephant in the room here," said one senior journalist, who argued that the political angle of the day often determines coverage, whether the specialist judges it significant or not. "Once you set that ball rolling," said another, who argued that a Westminster announcement obliged him to serve up a predictable set of reactions. Quite an amazing thing to say. He felt obliged to serve up a predictable set of reactions because of a Westminster announcement. Now, one example that authors point to is the economic reporting following the 2008 financial crisis. They write this: "After 2010, neither Labour nor the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition took public positions in favour of higher borrowing and debt. One respected academic who did, and says he was far from alone, argues that an anti-debt sentiment in the media took hold at that time. That is, the politics began, in his view, to distort economic reporting." Another criticism involved journalists' overall reliance on a pretty shoddy analogy, one we can thank Margaret Thatcher for, thinking that a nation's finances should be run like a household budget. So in this BBC report, they say that states don't tend to retire or die or pay off their debts entirely is one way national debt is not like a household or personal debt, not like a credit card, for example, and why analogies with household debt or suggestions the government must pay off or pay down the debt can cause intense debate. Clearly, pithy, accessible metaphors are valuable to journalists and audience, and paying off is a tempting phrase even to those who know the arguments because it seems to express the idea that there must be some degree of discipline over debt, even for a state. The report doesn't make any firm recommendations about how the BBC can achieve more impartiality when it comes to economics, although I suppose giving people some economics 101 training and maybe getting the journalists out of Westminster. I mean, it seems really here that one of the problems is people taking a lead from whatever each party is announcing. I thought that point about 2010 to 2015, where you didn't have either of the parties arguing against austerity. If Labour aren't arguing for it, if the Tories aren't arguing for it, if the Lib Dems aren't arguing for it, just doesn't exist as a position. I think that's quite an important summary, actually, of how the BBC works. On the one hand, I think I agree with those quotes I just read out, and I think it's been incredibly damaging for the country. I think the BBC buying into and reinforcing the austerity narrative is one of the reasons we have the crises in all the public services we talk about on this show every week, and why we have stagnant wages, et cetera, the disastrous state we find ourselves in as a country. At the same time, I mean, it's 12 years too late, but it's an interesting report by the BBC about the BBC. And what do you make of it?
Well, I think that's one of the things which is unique about the BBC, which is for all of its flaws and all of the ways in which it adopts right-wing talking points, political objectives, and also staffing, it has room for self-criticism in a way that I don't think any other media organization does. And that's because it is much more of a public service than it is anything else. It is a unique kind of institution within the British cultural landscape and within the British establishment. So I think that these things are really welcome. Something which can prompt self-reflection within the BBC is welcome. There are just a couple of things that I would perhaps add to it, which is one, I think that media as a whole has become really led by Westminster politics. And even something like the show that we do, Michael, we do talk about things which aren't just in the Westminster news cycle, but even me and you find ourselves kind of pulled in by this gravitational force. And part of that is because we exist in a media ecology where everyone has to talk about the thing that everybody is talking about, and that thing is Westminster. I think that you have had a huge overvaluation in the status of political journalists, in particular the lobby, those sacred few who have parliamentary lobby passes and who lead on what the political reporting is for their respective newspapers or broadcast channels. And one of the things that's happened in particular with newspaper coverage is that as newsrooms have shrunk and lots of kinds of original news gathering capacity has been cut back on, is that the news desk is led by your politics correspondent. So, whereas in the 70s and 80s, you might also have an industrial relations correspondent, you'll have correspondents who are in different parts of the country and everybody's phoning into the news desk. You have, the decline in status of those kinds of reporters if they exist at all, and you have the sort of preening over weaning status of political reporting on the other hand. And so that means that economic stories are totally subordinated to political framing. And unfortunately, you've got a cadre of journalists where I do think you've got a few who are genuinely curious and intellectually rigorous. They're not always liberal or on the left even. You've got a couple of right-wing journalists who I think you would put in that category as well of rigorous and curious individuals. But most of them can either be classified as just wanting to fly with the flock and puff up their own feathers and do anything for their own career advancement or profile, and others who are genuine right-wing ideologues. And so that kind of structural weakness within the lobby, it makes for a really bad culture when it comes to economics reporting, because you don't have the incentive to find out a different story from what everyone else is reporting. You don't have the political room to go, okay, well, this is the sort of received orthodoxy. Is it true? Because if you diverge too much from what the rest of the lobby are thinking, you're seen as, a weirdo and a crank, and you're totally out there. And also, the third thing is that you don't have people who I think are coming at it from the perspective of, am I wrong? Is the thing that's coming out of my mouth right now wrong? You have a crazy amount of certainty, and also a real suspicion of people who are saying anything different. I think it's a really unhealthy media culture.